So, welcome everybody to Tendering to Win. My name is Caroline Robinson, and this is the first of three sessions with Tara Whitney from Whitney Consulting. Thank you, Tara, for joining us. And Tara is on the WBN board and is also an active member of the Wheatbelt Business Network. So it's great to have you presenting for us. And without further ado, I will pass over to you.
Thank you, thank you. Now, can everyone hear me well enough? Yep, it's all good. Okay, great. All right, so I'm just going to share screen so you can see just a bit of a PowerPoint that I'll talk to. If anyone has any questions, as Caroline mentioned, just pop it into the chat would be the best way to go so that Caroline can grab those up and make sure I see them. Otherwise, I may not see the question come through. All right, we'll just share this and then start the slideshow. Right, can everyone see the slideshow now? Excellent, thank you, Yorksey. I can see your thumbs up. Okay, so as Caroline mentioned, tenders are a big thing. So we're going to do this in three sessions. So we won't necessarily cover everything today that you may want to know about, but we're going to start off with just understanding a bit about the tender process and just getting prepared to bid. And then we'll talk through how to answer qualitative criteria and a few more things about that in the next couple of sessions. So if you do have any questions after today, don't be discouraged. I'm sure we will cover them in the last two sessions, but do bring them with you as well. To those sessions so that we can make sure that by the end of the three sessions, everything that you want to know about tenders, you do know. Now, as Caroline mentioned, I am a WBN board member, but I also run Whitney Consulting, which is a grants, tenders and business case company. So we write essentially anything funding submission related to get you funds for your business or for local government, for state government. We write those funding submissions. So we are all past funding assessors. So it's myself up the top there, Jeanette with the little dog, and Alex. Alex and I were based in Pingelly. I've had to move back to the city, unfortunately, but Alex is still in Pingelly. We've all worked in various different governments. So I have worked in, actually I've worked in all. I've worked in federal, state and local government. Alex has worked in local and Jeanette's worked in state and federal government. So we've all been past funding assessors. We've all worked in government procurement. So we understand what government is looking for when they're putting out a tender. The workshop content for today, we're just going to talk a little bit about government procurement. And most tenders obviously are coming from government. So we'll talk about government procurement. We'll talk about the actual request for tender document, and then we'll talk a bit about planning. So we won't go into the detail about answering the questions in the tender just yet. We'll do that sort of next session, but we'll get you ready. We'll get ourselves ready to go. So an overview of government procurement. Now, for government, and I know it may seem laughable to some people, but it is very important that things are transparent and there's equal opportunity. When government is seen to favour or exclude any businesses, that is not a great thing. Now, if they're favouring your business because every time your business puts in a tender, it's a quality tender, that's okay, because there's a reason behind it. There's clear criteria. It is equal opportunity for everybody. You can all put in, you can all demonstrate your ability. It's not the case of one minister deciding that they like this particular business, so they're always going to fund that. That's how it should be. And it's very important that, that things are transparent and equal and open. So the other thing is that all governments have spending thresholds. So it depends on whether it's local, state or federal, but there are spending thresholds. So there's procurement guides which say if you are going to spend, say, $10,000 on a particular project, product or service, you need to get one written quote. If you're going to spend over $20,000, you need to get 3 written quotes. If you're going to spend over $150,000, you need to go out to full tender. So there's all different different levels of government thresholds as to what they need to do, and that's set. That's something that they're not allowed to mess with. If they are going to be spending more than 150,000 as a local government, they need to go to a full tender. There can be very rare exceptions to this, and that is where they can demonstrate there is only one possible business that can provide that service or product. And they have to demonstrate that, and that would be audited, and they could get into trouble if they say that only one business could possibly do this work, and then that's not the case. So it's quite strict. It's not something that a local or a state government just decides, oh, I feel like going to tender. Occasionally they will go to tender when they don't have to, and that is if they feel there's the potential that it might end up being more work than they had thought, or also if they just want to be really, really sure if there's any controversy, if there's any issue. For example, if the business that they think would win the work is in somehow related to the local government CEO or something like that. If there's any issues like that where they want to be really sure that they can demonstrate open, transparent decision making, they may go to tender if they don't have to. So the next thing is where to find opportunities. So it's really important that you know what tenders are available, because you can't apply for a tender, you can't put in to give yourself a chance if you don't know what's available. There are many government websites that you need to sign up to. So I'll just run through them quickly, and perhaps Caroline can also send a link via chat if that's easier. But WA state government tenders are on www.tenders.wa.gov.au. There's the WALGA, the WA Local Government Association e-tendering portal, which is Tenderlink. Now that's www.tenderlink.com/WALGA, WALGA. Then there's local governments. Now they often use vendor panel, which is www.vendor, panel.com.au. Now there may be others. There may be other portals that are used. I think there's one called 360, which can be used by some local governments. You just need to know which your local government. So if you're in a particular local area and you tend to be using that local government all the time, ask them and find out what is your tender portal that you use. Find out, have a look around and make sure you know all of the different ones. And what you do is you need to go in and create an account. So you create an account where you set your key search words, and then they will send you an email to say these tenders are open. So if you set key search words and you set a location, for example, you'll get an alert. It'll come back and it'll say to you, this particular tender is now being advertised, it's due on this particular date. So you're not having to constantly check in because you do get an alert. Having said that, I do personally, for my business, have something in my calendar for every Monday morning where I log on to each of my tender. So I log on to Tenders WA and I log on to Tenderlink and I have a quick look and just see what the new tenders are that have been released that week are, just to make sure, just in case the search words aren't picking up something that would actually be of interest to me. The other thing I do is I have networks. So I have networks and conversations, and the WBN is a great example of that, where I let people know. So all the local governments that I work with, state government departments that I work with, I let them know that I'm around and I'm interested. So there are times where they don't have to go to a full open advertised tender, and they'll just do a request for quote. In those cases, if you don't get sent the request for quote because it's a lower threshold amount, then you don't know that it exists. So it's very important to be using your networks, making people aware, this is what we do, and this is what we'd be interested in quoting for. So being very, very clear, and that involves having an online presence. It involves being on social media, and it involves talking to people, obviously, and having these business networks like the WBN, because then everybody knows this is what you do. And if they have that particular piece of work come up, oh, I'll send that request for quote off to those guys. I know they do that work. So that is really also really important, because as I said, not every tender is a really open advertised tender. Robbo, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that, Tara. That's a really great point that you've made about the networks and being in touch with local governments and making them aware of what you're doing. The other thing that we can offer through our network is we've got a close link with Megan Cray, who is the local content officer for the Wheatbelt, and her role is to encourage businesses into government contracts. And she regularly sends us opportunities that we then send to our membership about contracts that are coming up or requests for quotes. And there are local content officers across all of Western Australia. There's one in every region. So if you're outside of the Wheatbelt, if you just type into Google the local content officer and your region's name, they'll pop up. Tara, just a quick question from Ian. He is fortunate enough to be married to the Deputy Shire President in his local government, and if he wants to tender, are there any protocols that he should follow?
First of all, don't talk about it with your partner, and make sure that is something that you make clear. It just has to be very open and transparent. So in your tendering, when you tender, you need to make that clear and let them know that this is the situation. However, there is no conflict of interest. We do not discuss this. And also your wife would also need to do that. She would need to declare an interest, obviously, on her end to say that she can't be assessing the tender. She can't be a part of that. So if she knows that a particular piece of work is what you do, she should always be saying, and I'm sure she is already, I don't want to be part of this procurement because there would be a conflict of interest there. That's all. And that is a situation where I can imagine that the Shire may want to actually go to tender or something like that when they may not necessarily have to. So if they just do 3 requests for quote and you happen to be one of them and you get it, there could be some perceived. So it's not about necessarily whether there is any wrongdoing. It's about the perception of wrongdoing. So if you get it on a request for quote, there may be a perception. So they may want to go to tender even though they don't have to in that situation. But from your end, all you need to do is just make sure you don't speak to her about it. You are absolutely entitled to apply. It shouldn't have a negative impact on your business. You just make sure you don't canvass by having a chat to her about it. Yeah. Okay. Excellent. All right. So that's sort of a bit of a summary about where to find opportunities and making sure you have a chat to all of your local government areas to talk about that. The next thing I wanted to talk through quickly is a few myths about tenders and government procurement. Now, I just want to quickly, before I do that, check that everyone understands the terminology I'm using. So I've talked of requests for quotes, I've talked of requests for tenders. They will be referred to as RFQs or RFTs. So a request for tender is what we're talking about. We're talking about the full tender. Whereas a request for quote can be, it can just be whatever format you decide to put your quote in. It's just somebody comes and emails you and says, can you provide a quote for this piece of work? A request for tender or a tender document is much more strict, very clear templated response that you need to do. And everybody has to do it in the same way so that they're comparing apples and apples. Whereas a request for quote, you can put in whatever quote template you do. So an RFT or a request for tender is sort of what we're talking about. Now, in terms of myths, there are a lot of myths that go around with tenders and how people win them and who wins them and all of that sort of thing. So I wanted to run through a few myths and just talk about them. And if you have any other myths that you have heard, please pop them on the chat and Caroline will jump up and grab those if I haven't addressed them. So the first myth I've heard quite often is, oh, we've been doing the work for 10 years, 20 years, however often, we don't really need to do much on this tender. We've been doing it for ages. Or conversely, there's an incumbent. So there's another business that has been doing that work for 10, 15 years. There's no way anyone else has any chance. This is a myth on both sides. If you've been doing the work for 20 years or if somebody else has, it is a myth to think that you shouldn't put in. It is a myth to think that you, as the person who's been doing the work for so long, only needs to put in the bare minimum effort into a tender, because you're going to get the work because you've been doing it for 10, 15 years anyway. That is an absolute myth. The government procurement processes are such that there's a panel. So all tenders are assessed by a panel. On that panel, there must be one independent person. So the panels are generally 3 people. One of those must be independent. So they mustn't be from the area that is dealing with the work, particularly for state government work. And so being independent, they don't know you. They don't know your organisation. They've never heard of it. They don't know about the work that's been done. What they are looking at purely is the tender responses. They are reading the tender questions and the responses that have been made to it, and they are scoring them, and they are coming up with a score on your tender, not on any background information, because they don't know any of the background information. Now, everybody on the panel is supposed to only consider what is written in the tender. They are not supposed to consider any background info that they happen to know about that organisation, even if they do know you. So that's supposed to be how it works, is they're not supposed to consider anything else. So if you put in a really pathetic tender attempt because you think, oh, I've been doing the work for 20 years, of course I'll get it, you may find yourself very surprised and that you don't get it. Likewise, if you don't put in because somebody else has been doing it, well, you've got no option, you've got no chance of getting it. And often that is the case, is people think, oh, that company's been doing it for 10 years, I won't bother putting in. So they're the only ones that put in. So they can put in a pathetic attempt because they're the only ones that have put in. So don't buy into that myth. I'll talk about, is it in this one or is it in another one? Where at some stage I will talk about how all the assessment is done, and I'll go through all of that. But basically it is very systematic, and you are scored based on it. They try to take out the subjectivity. They try to make it really objective in how they score your tenders. So you need to make sure that you answer every question and answer it as best you can. Apart from that, you want to be telling your clients how great you are. You want to take the opportunity to demonstrate how professional and how wonderful you are. You don't want to be showing them something poor and second rate. Now, the second myth is similar in that it's, Bob's assessing the tenders. He loves us. We'll be fine. Bob thinks that we're great. We've worked with him. He's assessing the tenders. I know he's on the panel. We'll be absolutely fine. Exactly the same as what I said before. It's not assessed by one person. There is a panel. There's a standardized assessment template. You have to score according to that template. So it actually sets out, if you score at this level, if your response is at this level, you can get 3 out of 5. If it's at this level, you can get 4 out of 5. If you don't meet those levels, you can't get the score. And if you don't get the score, you can't get the tender. You can't win the tender. So there's 3 people normally on the panel, not just one person. One of them's independent. It doesn't matter if you know somebody that's on the panel. They standardize their assessment. The third myth is that only big companies can win tenders. That is not true. The reason bigger companies tend to win more of the tenders is because they have the ability to put in a really great tender. They have the workers and the time, and they can put together a great tender. But it's also that they're good at demonstrating the things that you need to demonstrate in a tender. They're good at demonstrating their capability, their experience, because they've probably got a lot of experience, and that's why they're big. They've slowly grown and gotten bigger. And they are the factors you need to demonstrate in a tender. So if you can demonstrate that you have the experience, you've got the capability, you've got a great methodology, and your price is good, you will win that tender against a bigger company. It is okay. You just need to demonstrate all of those areas of a tender. And you can form consortiums. So I'm putting in for a tender at the moment, and it's a lot more work than I can do within my company. I've got 3 staff, and I probably need 5 or 6 staff to deliver the tender that I'm actually literally writing yesterday and today. So I have gone and I have spoken with another Wheatbelt business and said, I need, let's partner. let's go in together to build up our capability so that I've got the capacity to deliver this tender, this contract. So we're combining together, and our experience combines. We talk about our methodology, and we can put in a tender that shows that even if I get sick, it's okay, because I've got a big enough team now that even if I get sick and I can't do the work, I've got a contingency plan there. I've got enough team members that I can now make sure I've taken that risk away from you, tender writer, person that you are, is awarding the tender. There's no risk there that I'm small, because I've got somebody on board with me. There's a backup. I've got a big enough team. Now, Caroline, did you want to say something on this one?
Yeah, just a question from one of our participants. Do you get to know who was on the tender panel after it is awarded?
Not usually. I can't say I've ever asked that question, but normally it won't be advertised who was on there. I can't see, if you desperately wanted to know, I think it would be an individual decision. I think it would be up to that local government or that state government as to whether they told you that information. But the actual scores that they scored, so the way they do it is they all individually score, and then they come together as a group and they come up with a consolidated score. So they agree. So if you've got one person giving a 5 and one giving a 10, they come together and they talk about, well, why did you give a 5? For these reasons, and I gave a 10 for these reasons, and they will come up with a consolidated score. So one of them might go, oh, I didn't even see that. I can't believe I gave them a 5. You are completely right. They should get a 10. Or the 10 might say, oh, you're right. They didn't actually demonstrate that at all. I've been completely misled by all of their fluff. Actually, it's more of a 5. Or they might come to an agreement that it's probably around about a 7. So individual people shouldn't have a huge impact on making it that, you're not going to win that tender because that one person didn't like you. Because between the three of them, they should come to a consolidated decision, and the person who's saying, oh, they're a 1 because I don't like them, they have to argue their point to the other 2 panel members. But yeah, whether or not you find out will be dependent, I think, on the individual organisation as to whether they tell you, but they should give you the feedback. They should give you the detail as to why you scored, how you scored. So you should always ask for feedback, and we'll talk about that at some point as well. So the next myth I've heard is that the 10% regional price preference. So I've heard a myth that there's a 10% regional price preference, and we're in the region, so we're going to look at how much it's going to cost us to deliver the project, and then I'm going to add 10% on top of that to my cost. That's not how it works. That's a bad idea. So your pricing, the reason there's a 10% regional price preference is because it acknowledges the fact that it can be more expensive to deliver the work for people in the regions, because transport costs might be higher, staffing might be higher. So it's that buffer. It's to stop that from being a factor. So with the 10% regional price preference, it should not mean that you add anything to your costings. Your costings should always be the same, in that you should look at how much it's going to cost you to deliver the contract, and then have your profit on top. There should be no factoring in, oh, there's a 10% regional price preference whatsoever. Does anyone have any other myths they've heard that they would like me to discuss, or any other things that they've heard on those lines that they're not sure if it's true or not? If you do, we can come back to it. If you think later on, oh, I also heard this and I wasn't sure if that's true or not, let me know and we can come back to it. So RFTs or requests for tenders. I'll just quickly go through the, it's time, how are we going? We're not too bad. I'll just quickly go through the standard sections of a tender document. So the common sections, usually in a tender, you'll have sections labelled read and keep. or they'll be labelled, you know, read and respond or respond to this section. So it's sort of telling you that these are the sections that you just need to read and you don't need to do anything specifically about it. And these are the ones that you need to fill out and you need to respond to. Now, each tender obviously is different. They're all written quite differently. Some can be massive, some can be pretty simple, but essentially they have similar sections. They might call them part 1 or part A or part B, however they do it. But the sections include the first one that is the housekeeping, or what I like to call the housekeeping. Now, this is often called conditions of tendering or conditions of responding. This section includes things like the definitions of all the words that they use, the contact person's details, information about how you respond, so how to submit your response, whether it's going to be via an online portal or you can email it, the file sizes, the due date, whether there is a mandatory site briefing, for example, all of that information that you need to know. So if you're going to, it will also talk about one of the things that often is in the housekeeping is whether you can tender for parts of the work or if you have to tender for the whole lot of the work. So that will also be included in there. It's essentially everything you need to know before you decide whether or not you're going to respond and before you start drafting. You must read this information and you must make sure that you comply with it. So if it says that you have to go to a mandatory briefing, you've got to go to the mandatory briefing. If it says that you can only have file sizes of a certain size, you've got to do that. The due date is not negotiable. This is really important information. It's the housekeeping side, but it's really important to know all of this information and comply with it. The next section, which can sometimes be part of the housekeeping, sometimes not, is the background. Now, the background is telling you why the tender exists. So it might be a bit about the organisation that's put out the tender, or maybe what's been done so far. So they might have done some work on this particular project so far, and you need to know all of that background. So that will be in there as well. Then there's the requirements. Now, these can be called so many different things. They can be called scope of works. They can be called statement of requirements. It can be called specifications. So it basically is the scope of work. So I tend to refer to it as the scope of works or the requirements. It's what they want you to do. So in this project, this is what we want you to do. So whether they call it statement of requirements, scope of works or specification, it's the detail. It can include technical information, drawings. It should tell you everything you need to know about what they are expecting from you and how they want you to do it. So what standard they need you to deliver it to, anything like that should be in there. If there is something you don't understand about this section, you must ask, because you cannot provide a price and a methodology about how you're going to deliver the work if you don't understand what they want, if you don't really understand exactly what it is they're expecting from you. There will always be details about how you ask in that housekeeping section. So there'll be a contact person's details, or there'll be something to tell you if you have a question, this is how you can ask the information. Now, be aware that sometimes the questions may close a day before or a couple of days before the actual tender closes. So don't leave it to the last minute to come up with questions. The other thing to know about questions is it will get shown to everybody. So everybody, for fairness, everybody needs to know all the same information. So if you ask a question, they're not just going to respond to you via verbally and that's it. If you ask a question, they will send a written response and they'll send it to everybody who has registered as having an interest in that tender, because everybody needs to know the same information. So be careful about how you ask a question and be careful about what questions you ask. But just make sure you really do understand that scope of works. The next common section is the conditions of contract. That can also be called service agreement details. Essentially, this is the housekeeping if you win the contract. So it's if you win, this is how the delivery of the contract is going to be managed. This is the legal part of it. So it's what insurances you'll need, any other things you need to know about engaging in the contract. So whether there's confidentiality agreement going to be required, so whether you can talk about the work. It often includes an example of a contract agreement, so something you'll have to sign. So once you get told, yes, you're the winner, you'll have to sign some sort of a terms of engagement, a legal agreement. So it can often include an example of that contract agreement. You can negotiate changes to that agreement, but it's worthwhile having a look to see what it is they're going to require of you once you've been successful. The next section is the respondent's offer. So this is the section where you actually have to do something. You actually have to prepare your response in this section. So it can be called respondent's offer or the response form or returnable schedules. Whatever form it is called, it's your offer, it's your response. So this is the part you complete and submit. It's made up of your business details, you know, your ABN, all those sorts of business details. The compliance criteria are basically a yes or a no. Do you comply with the specifications? Yes. Will you obtain all of these insurances that you'll need? Yes. It's a yes or a no compliance criteria. If you don't comply, sometimes that's okay, but we will talk about that in the next session. So what I'll do in the next webinar is I'll go through the compliance criteria and the qualitative criteria and talk through how to respond to those. But I'm just letting you know this is what your response is made up of. So the compliance criteria are basically a yes or a no. The qualitative criteria, that's the part that they score. So they can be called, you know, merit criteria, qualitative criteria. They are the parts that they read and they provide a score on, and this is what you are assessed on. And then there's the price schedule. So I will cover all of these criteria in the next session next Friday, where we will talk about how to respond to those. So the three key areas of your offer that are assessed are the methodology, so how you're going to deliver the contract, the organisational capability, so that's you as an organisation, how capable you are, your experience, etc., and the price. And that is all covered in those qualitative criteria and the price section. So conscious of time, we're going okay. So the next thing I want to talk about is preparation. So getting prepared to tender. There are often short turnaround times for requests for tender or RFTs. And at the same time as you're writing these RFTs, you still have to be doing your work. So you really need to be as prepared as possible because they are short time frames and you can't just stop doing the work of your business. So you need to look at each section and see what can be prepared ahead of time. There is a lot that can be prepared ahead of time. Generally, generally it's related to organisational capability. You can't prepare your budget too much before the tender comes out because you don't know what they're going to ask you to do. What you can do though in your budget is you can know what it costs you to deliver certain things. So you will have done projects in the past. So if you are aware and have your costs really clear as to this is how much it costs us to deliver certain amounts of work, that will make it much easier when the tender opens for you to do your budget because you know, oh, well, you know, I charge for that piece of work, I charge X amount per day, or this is how much we charge because I know that how much it's cost us in the past to deliver that sort of work. So if you have that information, it will help you with the budget. But there is a whole lot about organisational capability that you can do in advance. So the first thing that you can do is you can make sure that when the assessors Google you, they can find you. So if you have an online presence, social media, website, whatever that is, your online presence is quite important because if I am assessing a tender for an organisation, they're telling me how wonderful they are and they've done all this stuff, and I go to Google them and they just don't exist online, I immediately think, oh, well, they can't be that big. They can't be that impressive an organisation because I can't find anything about them. I can't even find reviews or anything like that. So looking at your online presence is something I would recommend you do when you're not in the middle of applying for a tender. But the other things that you can prepare ahead of time, so business details. You're always going to be asked the same business details, have it all ready to go, have your insurance certificates all ready to go, have them in a folder, which is your tender folder. You know, have a tender folder set aside, which has business details, insurance certificates, anything like that that's needed. So it's really quick and easy for you to pull out, or for your staff member to pull out and pop it into the tender response. So that stuff's all really easy, and it's usually the same information that's asked every time. The next part is the organisational capability section. Every single tender document will ask you to demonstrate your organisational capability without exception. Because if you are not a capable organisation, then they don't really want you on board, no matter how amazing your price is and no matter how brilliant your methodology might be. If you're not capable of pulling it off, there's too much of a risk for them to give you money. Your organisational capability means the past experience of your organisation and the past experience of your key staff and key personnel, the processes, procedures and policies you have in place within your organisation. That includes for risk management, occupational health and safety, whatever business processes and practices you have. Your compliance with any legislation, any standards, accreditations, registrations, if you're ISO accredited or whatever else, other licenses or registrations you have. Your organisational structure, so how your business is set up, and the governance that's in place within the organisation. So how it works, who reports to who, what are your reporting processes, how does that all function? Do you have weekly team meetings? Do you have committee meetings? How is the governance of the organisation run? And then it's your organisation's capacity to complete the work in the time frame. So that means, what else have you got going on? Have you got so much work on at the moment that there's no way you've got the capacity, the ability to deliver it? And it can also mean, as I said, for the tender that I'm writing at the moment, it can mean you just don't have enough staff. So if you don't have the capacity, you don't have enough staff, you've got to fix that. You can't just go, oh, we'll just give it a crack anyway. If you can see that you clearly don't have enough staff to deliver the work that they want delivered, partner with somebody else. Get some other organisation on board to beef up your capacity to be able to deliver the work. So requests for tender, RFTs can ask for this information in a number of different ways. They can ask lots of smaller questions. So things like demonstrate previous similar examples of similar work that you've done. They can ask for referees. They can ask for how will you manage risk in this project. They can ask questions about your key personnel and their CVs and what they're going to do on the project and what their past experience and skills are. They can ask for a table which says identify the availability of the key personnel. So talk about how many hours they're available for each week or percentage of their availability. They can ask lots of those little questions to get your organisational capability out of you. Or they can simply ask you one or two questions, which is really broad reaching, which says something like, demonstrate that you have the organisational capability to perform this contract, or identify the key personnel and their availability for the duration of the contract. Now that doesn't give you as much guidance, but you still need to include the same level of information. You still need to talk about all those things that I said, past experience, compliance, etc. So just because they don't say, are you ISO accredited, doesn't mean that they don't want to know. When they ask about your capability, they're asking about your standards, accreditations, your registrations, your licenses. They're asking about all those things. They might just not ask them in specific questions, but that is part of demonstrating your organisational capability. Now, I'll go into more detail about this next week, obviously, when we talk about how to address the criteria, but this is one section you can prepare for. This is one section that doesn't change a lot. The only time it changes is when you win more work. So every time you win more work, that becomes more another example of similar previous work that you've completed that you can add to your response. So I would suggest that you have a section, a tender folder, which has all your business details and insurance, but also has some organisational capability responses, even if it's dot points that talks about, even if it's just examples of past work. So if you have a spreadsheet, for example, of all the work that you've previously done, what it involved, who was involved, the value of that contract. All of that information is going to be very useful when you get to doing your RFT. But your organisational capability, as I said, you can draft something up. You can have a list of all of your policies and procedures and processes. You can have a paragraph which summarises and says how your organisation structure is set up, how your governance is run, what reporting you do, all those sorts of things you can have already done. So you will need to craft your response to address the specific questions they ask. So how they ask it, as I said, varies. You will need to craft it, but you can have everything prepared and ready to go around organisational capability. And that will save you some precious hours when the RFT is due and you still have your own work to do. So I would go through each area of your organisational capability and at least draft dot points on them. Now, I have actually written a blog on this. So if you want to, now you have this video, but also I can possibly send Caroline a link to the blog that I wrote on organisational capability, which actually goes through each of those dot points where I've said this is what organisational capability means, and that may help as well. To some people prefer to see things written down, which is me. Now, as I said, these examples of previous work you've done is really important, and you'll see how important that is when we talk about how to answer the qualitative criteria next week. So make sure every time you win a new piece of work, add that to your organisational capability document, because it's another example that you can draw upon to demonstrate that you are capable, you are able. Right, so in summary, then, each request for tender needs to be completed to the best of your ability. Don't buy into the myths that say that you don't have to put in as much effort in this particular one. You must do it, because it's also an opportunity for you to demonstrate how great you are as an organisation and what your capabilities are. Even if you don't win the tender, you can demonstrate that to the panel for them to go, oh, I didn't realise these guys were so good. Next time I do a request for quote, I'm definitely going to ask them for a quote, because they've just demonstrated to me how professional they are and how good they are. So it's an opportunity as well to demonstrate that you guys are really good. So don't waste that by putting in something that's subpar. Sign up to all the online portals to be notified about opportunities, and use your networking to make sure that everybody knows what you do and that you're interested in these sorts of tender opportunities. Read the tender document thoroughly, especially that housekeeping section, which tells you exactly how to do it, and the statement of requirements or the scope of works, which tells you exactly what they want you to do. Prepare what you can ahead of time, because you will be pushed for time. Business details and organisational capability are the two main areas, but also consider your budget. Consider looking at, if you haven't in the past, look at what you've charged for previous works, and then figure out whether you made money on that one, or that one you took a bit of a hit on that one. And work out where you lost money, where you won money, where you think you quoted pretty well and it was reasonable, and come up with some understanding of what it costs you to deliver various pieces of work so that you can quote on that really well. Because that is a really, really difficult thing to do, is walking that fine line between making enough money from the contract and not putting in too high a quote that you don't win the contract. It's a fine line that you need to balance. And to do that, you need to know how much it costs you to deliver the work. Keep a list of examples of different types of works you've completed. As you go along, make sure you keep that list updated. Make sure that all new staff that come in, if they're going to be key personnel, make sure you keep a copy of their resume, because you're going to need it. So keep all of that stuff in the document so that you're prepared ahead of time. And that's it for today. Now, we will be going over, let me grab up. Sorry, go on, Caroline, did you have a question?
No, you're okay, Tara.
I was just going to say that we've got another 2 sessions to go over because obviously, you know, as I said, tenders are a big thing. It takes a lot of information. So the next session next week is, what are we talking about next week? We're talking about, I should have had this up and ready. We're talking about how tenders are assessed next week. So we're going to talk about the compliance and qualitative criteria, weighting and scoring, and how assessors actually assess a tender, which is obviously very, very important information for you to know so that you know how to write a tender. Because if you don't know how they're assessing it, it's harder to obviously nail it and get it right. And then the week after that, we're going to talk about writing to win. So the real writing part of it. So that's the how to answer the qualitative criteria, what to do if you need help, getting feedback, all that sort of information. Does anyone have any questions on what we've talked about today?
Tara, there was just one question of, and if you like, just if you want to stop sharing your screen, then we'll get everybody back, if that's okay. There was one question about cheapest always wins as a myth. Do you think that, yeah, how would you answer that one?
Definitely not. So I actually I won one, it was about 2 months ago. And the guy actually said to me, you were the most expensive. So out of all the tenderers, I was the most expensive and I won because I was the best. Now, I was the best because I've got the experience, because I demonstrated that experience, and because I showed them that my methodology, the way I was going to deliver their contract, was going to get them the results that they wanted. So they didn't want to risk going with the cheaper option and not get the quality that they could see that I was going to give them. So no, it's definitely not the cheapest always wins. But if you are the cheapest and you have demonstrated the quality, then you're definitely going to win.
Are there any other questions from anyone online? And if you do want to have a question, just unmute yourself.
Could I put another question? I don't mean to dominate the questions channel. But I'm wondering, Tara, about your view of the paid subscription tender notifications services. Like we subscribe to TenderLink, I think it's $90 a month. Is their coverage good enough that it's worth it in general?
Look, you'd have to look at the individual one and see what they have and what they offer. It is information that is all freely available. So you're not getting any tenders that aren't freely available elsewhere, but what they are doing is collating it all for you so that you don't have to spend the time. So it's up to you as a business owner where your efforts are best spent. So you could go and sign up to all the different tender portals to make sure and put your keyword searches in, and then you wouldn't have to pay that. But it's as to whether or not it's worth it for you.
Yep.
So it's not a yes or a no response on that one. It's whether or not you have the time to do it yourself, or whether it's easier for you just to pay for it to be done. I would think, I personally don't pay for any tender subscriptions like that. I've gone and signed up to a few and I'm happy with that, but it's up to you. Now I've had a question which is asked, do you know who you're tendering against? Not normally. It's not information that should necessarily be shared with you. It should be private. You can find out in some cases because people will tell you, oh yeah, I put in for that one. And also there are situations where if you're asking a question and you put your name to the question, so the tender that I'm actually in the middle of writing at the moment, the questions all come through on the portal. And if you write your question and then write Tara Whitney, there's nobody filtering it. So it just comes out to everybody as a question. This is the question, Tara Whitney. So everyone knows, oh, Tara Whitney's asking about that tender. She's probably putting in for it. So I have found out for a few of them in that way, but the panel should not be disclosing that information. So no, you wouldn't necessarily know who you're tendering against. But having said that, it shouldn't really matter, because you should be putting in your best effort. And, you know, in some cases it might be that you've done an amazing job and there was just one business that put in that did have a bit better experience than you. In that case, just take the feedback, find out exactly what it was that they had that was better than you. Did they have more, you know, better organisational capability? Did they have some policies that were in place? What exactly was it about that one business? You know, I came second. Or what was it about that one business that the assessors liked more than mine? Find that out so that next time you can either partner with somebody who brings that skill that you didn't have in, or you can look at creating those policies and processes within your business to build your capability in that way.
Brilliant. That's good, Tara. Are there any other questions? No? Okay. All right, brilliant. Well, what we'll do is we will send this recording out to everybody, and I will send the links that Tara was talking about, as well as the blog link regarding organisational capability. So expect that in your inbox today. And yeah, we'd love to see you next Friday to ask some more questions of Tara, because she's got some very good insight knowledge. And yeah, thank you very much, Tara, for your time.
No problem. Thank you for having me.